A quiet farming corner of Millstone Township, New Jersey, 1932. 75 years later, the renamed town of Roosevelt occupies this location. What were the forces which created in the 1930s this unique Jersey Homesteads community of 200 homes on the leading edge of town planning theory and architectural design? This is a portion of Pine Drive of that community, and I invite you to participate in a quest that seeks to answer, why do these houses look this way, and why does the town have its particular configuration?
When you look at Roosevelt, there are a number of different strands are reflected in its planning and its architecture, and in fact in the whole concept. And you can start with the Garden City movement, which really developed in England in the 1890s. It was the product of a rather remarkable man named Ebenezer Howard. And his idea was important in two respects. The first, that he was trying to create garden cities, which would be communities that would be both cities, would both have an urban quality and would relate to nature, would have green belts around them and through them and so forth. And the second was that his vision was of small communities, not necessarily as small as Roosevelt, but small communities that would not only be places where people would live, but where they would work, they would shop, they would organize their entire lives within that community.
Howard's plan called for essentially self-sufficient satellite cities of about 30,000 people. The main feature of his diagram is the alternating concentric circles of green space and housing. Thought of as a pie, each of the 6 identical slices is bounded by grand boulevards 120 feet wide. At its very center is a citywide garden surrounded by such community services as a hospital, City Hall, library, and museum, all encircled by a large central park. The Crystal Palace is a huge glass enclosure of shops and winter gardens, followed next by avenues of housing with individual or communal gardens. Then comes the Grand Avenue, a broad expanse of open space where schools and churches are located, then more housing, an outer ring of factories, offices, and warehouses encompassed by a circular railway which connects to the main rail line, and finally the surrounding farmland. Howard's motivation was to improve the quality of life of workers of all classes by combining the best of the city and the country in the form of a network of small, decentralized cities.
The relationship between working and living in proximity to nature, that comes from Ebenezer Howard. And that was his reaction against an industrialized England that was so industrialized that some of those towns in the Midlands would turn absolutely dark at noon from all the smoke and the unhealthy conditions. And Howard was out to overcome that.
Fundamental vision that really led to this. And this was a vision that was explored by people in the United States and in Europe a great deal after Howard, but particularly in the 1920s, during the period leading up immediately to the New Deal to Roosevelt.
While the principles of the Garden City became a widespread planning approach, rarely, if ever, were all of Howard's concepts applied. Even Letchworth, United Kingdom, recognized as the first garden city, and therefore a model of such a community, did not contain internal green spaces. Radburn, New Jersey possessed such spaces, but not much in the way of an external greenbelt, while the town of Greenbelt, Maryland, lacked an outer industrial zone. To aid in visualizing the Garden City concept as it applies to Roosevelt, let's look at a map of the borough. First, the streets. Rochdale Avenue bisects the town in a north-south direction. Branching off of it to the east are Oscar Drive, Homestead Lane, Farm Lane, and Lake Drive, all connected on their eastern end by North and South Valley roads, and finally Brown Street. To the west are Nurko Road, Pine Drive, and Tamara Drive, the latter curving around to intersect at South Rochdale and Clarksburg Roads. This shape basically corresponds to the Howard circular theme, with Rochdale Avenue splitting the circle roughly into two halves, yielding curving village streets with light traffic.
And after dinner, I would meet two other girlfriends, and we would walk the two circles in town. And to this day, having moved back, there are walkers, and many of them still take that route.
And I like the idea that when you take a walk, you meet people you know and you say hello, except sometimes it takes too long. So we used to walk at night so we wouldn't meet anybody.
Three streams, although small, play very significant roles. An unnamed stream to the north that feeds into the Assunpink, as does the centrally located Empty Box Brook, and the Assunpink Brook itself to the south and southwest.
When they planned the village and they laid it out, they did two things. The first was to create a farm belt that wrapped around most of the village. So the first part was the green belt of farms that formed the external green belt.
Every house backs up to woods, and so you very quickly became what I call ruralized. You know, they talk about streetwise in New York, but we were like ruralized. It was like very interesting. And the kids would make huts in the back, and we'd go into the woods.
To the north, there is the small unnamed creek, its wetlands, and the farmed and preserved spaces beyond Oscar Drive to the approximate vicinity of Nurko Road and beyond. To the east is the open space roughly between the cemetery and the horse farm, and to the south and southwest, the Assunpink.
The second part, which was in some respects even more ingenious, and I think actually probably means more to most people who live here, is what they did is each house sits on a half-acre lot. The basic unit is 100 by 200, 100 feet wide, 200 feet deep. Obviously, the individual lots vary tremendously because the streets curve and there are courts coming out and so forth, but the basic starting point was a 100 by 200 module. So the basic idea then was that behind each 100 by 200 module that represented a house lot, an equal amount of space, 100 by 200, was reserved for common open space. And all of the back pieces were consolidated to create a common band of open space that wove between the rows of houses.
Now the house had half of an acre of land, but as I said, there was town woods behind it, and you were allowed to do whatever you wanted with those woods, so it was like having almost an acre of ground if you wanted to.
The two internal green spaces for the original 200 homes are the school grounds extending to Pine Drive and Tamara Drive, part of which consists of the natural stream corridor of Empty Box Brook, with the second located between Homestead Lane and Farm Lane.
I used to take a lot of walks in the woods, and alone, and I just loved it.
This is still a very, very positive asset of Roosevelt.
Of the layout, I've always thought the most exciting, ingenious thing. I've been to Greenbelt, Maryland, and it's not Greenbelt. And it's very sad, but we are Greenbelt. We've maintained that.
While the town layout was a product of planners, one can see how the local topography lent itself to the utilization of Garden City principles by the pre-existing configuration of farm fields and stream corridors. How close did Jersey Homesteads come to meeting the criteria for a garden city? Quite close, closer than many such towns. The elementary school grounds functioning as a central town green, a community service center dominated by the school, housing on mostly curving streets, internal green spaces, industry on the periphery, all surrounded by an external greenbelt. Perhaps resident Gail Hunton, author of the document that led to Jersey Homestead's designation as a National Historic Site, expressed it best, calling the town clearly an American suburban expression of the English garden city idea, primarily because of the relatively large lot sizes and emphasis on single-family and semi-detached housing.
People don't realize the excellence of the product they've inherited, but it is exquisitely done.
Of course, the open spaces, particularly the internal ones, in the very early days of the town, didn't look anything like they do today.
It was used as a playground. From the back of my house, I could go out the back door and walk to school right across the playground.
I can remember meeting my first friend and walking across, my parents taking me by hand and walking across the field to a house on Farm Lane, so that there were no woods there.
A second theme, which is reflected specifically in the architecture, is the Bauhaus Movement, which was a German architectural and building and design school, if you will, that emerged in the 1920s. And their philosophy, I guess one can sum it up as trying to create modern houses, modern furnishings, a modern design vocabulary for modern people. And it was very much a reaction against the ornamentation and the elaboration and what they saw as the elitist character of 19th century architecture. And so they went for very basic, unadorned, unornamented buildings using materials like concrete and steel that were not seen as traditional building materials.
The Bauhaus started in 1919 in Weimar in 1923. They had problems in Weimar, so they moved to a new headquarters in Dessau. And when they were there, they built this building with the school and workshops called which they referred to as the Bauhaus Building. And was able to see the Bauhaus Building and also to visit the called the Turton Estates, which were built by Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus Movement. And going through that property, you could see how this had a great influence on the designers of Roosevelt, on Jersey Homesteads. The style of Jersey Homesteads is following the general principles that we see in the Bauhaus buildings. What you see in Dessau is row housing, but the flat roofs, the rectilinear form, very functional design of the buildings, and building elements like the overhangs in some places that are quite recognizable in the buildings here. The building that looks the most like most of these buildings here, like the one-story buildings, was built earlier in Weimar. It's designed by one of the Bauhaus masters called Georg Müsche. That was called the House on Horn, and that building is still standing. And if you look at pictures of it and you compare them to the buildings in Roosevelt, you can see that they're very similar.
They're compositions of juxtaposed rectilinear forms with horizontal massing and open plans and smooth exterior surfaces painted white, follow the stark and functional, unadorned modernist aesthetic.
The Bauhaus was not simply an institution that taught architecture, but rather attempted to integrate fine arts, crafts, and technology, at the same time incorporating a populist undertone. Prominent artists were among its teachers. Gropius's ideas are expressed as follows.
What he wants you to do was see stuff designed for the industrial process, so he can produce things that would be beautiful and be of high quality and be inexpensive, so that the average working person could have access to a well-designed house, well-designed furniture and other implements, of the theory that this makes people's lives better, that art has a positive effect on people's lives and shouldn't be something only for the elite, but should be there for everybody. In fact, they produced it, and this is one way they helped to keep the institution going, was that they were able to sell things that they produced.
In fact, the design of wallpaper was the school's most profitable product.
I think its impact was more seen in commercial buildings. They don't see it as much in residential buildings. One place that you do see it, that probably the city in the whole world that has the greatest representation of Bauhaus architecture, because it's the basic architecture of the town, is Tel Aviv. Because Tel Aviv was built, it was largely built in the 20s and 30s. So that much of so now the old Tel Aviv, which they're trying hard to preserve as an architectural landmark, that's what is distinctive about the Jersey Homesteads development, is that it was actually a development built that way. That I don't think you'd see. I think you may see individual homes.
This was an architectural style that was unique among the 99 homestead towns of the New Deal.
And a lot of this was to create houses that would be perceived as modern, appropriate for a machine age, the machine age. And in fact, I think one of the more interesting aspects of that is the fact that all of the houses have garages. Now, in the 1930s, it was not even routine to put garages in far more expensive middle-class houses that were built. Some had, some didn't. The idea of a garage was much more of a statement than a practical necessity. Most of the people who lived in Roosevelt originally did not have cars. But the garage was a statement that said, this is a house for a modern era. This is a house for the automobile age. So it was an ideological statement about the architecture. So the Bauhaus movement and the whole idea of modernism and machine age architecture was a second strand.
At the same time, it should be recognized that the Bauhaus was just one of many forms of modernism in the early decades of the 20th century, all of which were primarily used in commercial and luxury residential construction. The captivation with the machine age and its new technologies was often paired with a sense of social responsibility. The changes rocking the world of architecture were reflected in the ferment in the arts and the intellectual climate of the time. Over the next several decades, the Bauhaus proved to be the dominant modernist force in art and architecture in several areas of the world.
The third strand, which I think is not an architectural one so much as a social one, but which underlies the community in a very fundamental sense, was the kind of utopian strand about creating a new society. The idea that you could create an environment in which people would work and live differently and more healthily and more cooperatively than in the slums or teeming cities that they came from. And I would say that this comes from an underlying socialist value structure, which interestingly was very strong among the Jewish population from which the original settlers of Roosevelt sprang. I mean, this is one of the things about these houses. This is a very egalitarian sort of architecture. I mean, yes, the houses have their differences. Some have 2 bedrooms, some have 3, some have 4, some have 2 stories, some have 1. But there's absolutely no sense, or there certainly wasn't when Roosevelt was originally developed, as you went around the town, that you would say, ah, that's a rich person, that's a poor person, that's a middle-class person. Because the houses were all very neutral from a social and economic standpoint.
Elegant effort to come up with this really very high class, marvelously designed community. And for poor people, wow.
The first step in implementing this planned town was the purchase of approximately 1,250 acres comprising 8 contiguous farms in Millstone Township, New Jersey for about $100,000 in late 1933. Why this particular land? Well, it was good farmland, relatively inexpensive, and located midway between New York City and Philadelphia, seen as ready markets for the garments to be made in the town's factory. Benjamin Brown thought this was the land to buy, which was also about 2 miles from his own 300-acre farm in Ettrick. The community was to be organized on a cooperative basis, with garment workers from the Bronx and Brooklyn dividing their time seasonally between factory work and farm labor. The first known town plan placed virtually the entire village between Nurko Road and Oscar Drive, well north of where it is today. Each rectangle represents a house lot, and the vertical road to the left is Nurko Road. Continuing toward North Rochdale Avenue, we come upon a playground, school, stores, a park, a factory, the intersection of Nurko Road and North Rochdale Avenue, more housing on the east side of the road, and then Oscar Drive to the right. The small, unnamed northern stream is dammed to form a lake between the town and land to the south. This is the area between Homestead Lane and Farm Lane, North Rochdale Avenue, and a sweep of land basically where Pine Drive is now. Obviously, this 1934 concept plan does not exhibit much in the way of Garden City attributes. The dark line to the left is Empty Box Brook, and we're essentially following the future path of Tamara Drive to the intersection with South Rochdale Avenue and Clarksburg Road. The most obvious feature of an early 1935 plan is the traditional rigid grid pattern of 1-acre lots. Rochdale Avenue is the angular vertical road, and Empty Box Brook divides the 2 blocks of grids. This plan does, however, place the town essentially where it is today. A plan later that year has begun to take on some familiar features, namely the distinctive half-circle curve of Pine Drive and Tamara Drive, and the open space between these roads and Rochdale Avenue, the vertical road in the center. However, with the retention of the 1-acre lot size, there is no internal green space between Homestead Lane and Farm Lane. By the end of 1935, a town plan had been drafted that includes all of the present-day streets and then some. What looked to be angular roads in various places, including both sides of Pine Drive and Tamara Drive, are actually just right-of-ways, apparently meant to allow car or farm machinery access to the rear garden plot portion of each lot. Lake Drive and Brown Street make their appearance, extending almost to the eastern boundary of the borough, and Valley Road runs the full length from Farm Lane to Brown Street. At this point in the history of the project, a new planner-architect, Alfred Kastner, was hired. He was instructed to cut costs by eliminating all of the right-of-ways and also all of the roads in the southeastern section of town, namely Lake Drive, Brown Street, and South Valley Road, all shown now as future proposed roads, as is an extension of Farm Lane. Kastner created the 3 courts and School Lane, and also added houses throughout town to make up for those on the streets that were dropped. More importantly, the lot sizes were reduced from 1 acre to 1/2 acre, apparently at Kastner's suggestion.
Germany, what happened is, they thought that was planned that way. It wasn't planned that way. What happened is, the foundations were in, and then there was a lot line. Now, somebody had figured here that there was enough land between this guy and this guy, so he could grow all the food that he needed in that house. Well, that's a PR. That's not a right PR. So I said, now, wait a minute. That land isn't so perfect. Why don't we just make a green area out of that and then tie together, you see?
Kastner had to have been familiar with Garden City principles. He makes this decision sound casual, but it had a major impact. Suddenly, an internal green space was created between Homestead Lane and Farm Lane, and a less dramatic but similar consequence was felt throughout the town. So, this was the final plan for the construction of the 200 homesteads. A town center, interior green spaces, housing on curving streets, industry on the periphery, all surrounded by an exterior green belt. In effect, a garden town in the country.
The designer's choice of Bauhaus-influenced architecture for Jersey Homesteads must have seemed appropriate to the experimental nature and underlying principles of the original community.
In addition to the radical style of the homes reflecting the uniqueness of the homestead, was the fact that the construction process itself consisted of a number of experiments. But it all began rather prosaically with surveying, clearing, and infrastructure installation. The earliest known house sketch, dated 1934, called for a conventional cottage of 6 rooms, pitched roof, brick exterior, and no cellar. Nothing came of this design, nor apparently of another one, dated the following year, of a bungalow structure, complete with garage, covered porch, workroom, 4 bedrooms, and a partial cellar. An entirely different type of construction method, called rammed earth, employing a pressurized mixture of clay, sand, and some portion of aggregate, often concrete, was another suggested proposal. A year and a half after the land was purchased, a new federal agency, the Resettlement Administration, was formed to supervise all such projects. All activity, such as it was slowed considerably at Jersey Homesteads because the agency had serious doubts about the economic viability of the garment factory, and also because there was no agreement between Benjamin Brown and union head David Dubinsky. The dynamic leader of this agency, Rexford Tugwell, a former Columbia University economics professor and member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, was a firm believer in the Garden City concept and interested in prefabricated housing. The technique selected was precast concrete walls, made by a company headed by Quentin Twachtman, a builder of large conventional homes. It's unclear to what degree the government looked into his experience of actually having built a house using this method, but in fact, a process of this type had been used successfully in this country at that time, as well as in Europe by Walter Gropius and others.
Turton Siedlung in Dessau was built by the city. They wanted housing for the workers in the city, and that they hired Gropius to design it and to build it. And of course, what he did there, he was able to put up these houses, put up the framing of each house in about 5 hours, using concrete, using concrete and cranes and concrete and getting it all into place.
At that time, there on the Clarksburg Road, what roughly is considered to be Lake Drive, there was a factory called the Slab Factory. And that's where the slabs were made for the original 3 and 4 bedroom houses.
A large slab factory measuring 75 by 160 feet, as well as 4 curing sheds of about the same size, were erected for the purpose of producing the slabs.
They thought it would be best to have the factory that manufactured the slabs right in town. The reason why they wanted to do that is because it was very, very expensive and costly to try to move slabs of that size from outside of the town. So that was the rationale that was behind it.
The structures were built to allow them to be disassembled, on the theory that if this technique was successful, it could be used at other sites. But apparently, the slab walls collapsed, most likely because of faulty manufacturing, but possibly due to the fact that they weren't anchored to the foundations correctly. An alternative theory is that a patent dispute was the reason this construction mode was abandoned. Almost 2 years after the start of the project, all that had been completed were 2 wells, water and sewer lines, the main streets laid out, and an indeterminate number of foundations. But it was the idle $200,000 slab factory that triggered the sealing off of the site, with armed guards stationed on the roads into the construction area in order to limit negative publicity, which would have strengthened existing suspicions of mismanagement and corruption. The government needed to urgently hire an architect experienced in public housing who could build 200 sound houses cheaply and quickly. Alfred Kastner was their choice. Born and educated in Germany, he was the co-architect of the critically acclaimed Carl Mackley houses in Philadelphia, the first public housing project in the country. At a time when it was rare for even privately financed complexes to incorporate open space, here was a public, modernist structure for factory workers with green spaces and a swimming pool, a far cry from prevalent tenement conditions. While no doubt influenced by recent construction in Germany and knowledgeable about the Bauhaus and Garden City movements, he was perhaps most accurately described by architecture critic Richard Pomer as a draftsman and building technician, pragmatic and undoctrinaire. Later in life, he described himself as the poor man's architect because of his extensive career in public housing. Kastner maintained a diary-like daily report during the entire project, detailing every memo, meeting, and phone call, compulsively noting even a fire drill. He demonstrates his lifelong, strenuous work ethic in this notation. Proceed to Philadelphia, where he had his office, at night, arriving 1:30 a.m. Saturday. Proceeded to Trenton, 7:08 a.m., meeting Kahn and Ford on train. He worked 7 days a week, including evenings, for the first several months on the job. Told by Tugwell to complete Jersey Homesteads in a year, the end of 1936, Kastner quickly assembled a drafting room headed by Louis Kahn, a talented but less experienced architect.
In 1932, Kahn had been working for the firm of Zanzinger, Borie, Maderi in Philadelphia on the design of the Treasury Building down in Washington, D.C. And as we know, the Depression was heating up at that point, and so he was furloughed from his job. And so for the better part of the next 4 years, he was essentially unemployed. But this served as a really wonderful opportunity for him to reassess his thinking about architecture and to focus on some of the pressing questions of the day, including the question of housing in the Depression era, but also taking advantage of the best technology of the day. And so for Kahn, he made great use of the time in a theoretical perspective. And so by the time 1936 rolls around, he's ready to do some interesting work.
While both flat concrete and pitched wooden roofs were studied, Kastner was most likely predisposed to make the critical design decision to use flat roofs. This roof style, more than any other feature, put Jersey Homesteads in the architectural vanguard of that time. It was a design radically different from the prevalent bungalows of the mushrooming middle-class suburbs of that era. The government supported him, but he had a tough job selling this style to Benjamin Brown and his associates, who favored a traditional design.
This was constructing a community, constructing in the best possible ways, experimental in marvelous ways, courageous at a time when it was a time of national despondency.
Saddled with an idle slab plant and the federal mandate to maximize employment of those on relief, he had the plant converted to the production of cinder blocks, a cheap material that lent itself to the use of unskilled labor. At the same time, he authorized extensive experimentation with concrete slabs for roofs instead of walls. But they proved to be too expensive, and poured concrete was used instead, sometimes with shoes included. Little cinder block houses held down by concrete slabs were never more completely studied. Robert Noble, junior architect, drafting room. When it was realized that cinder block could be bought more cheaply on the open market, the plant was totally abandoned. Practical on-site problems aside, the simple materials of cinder block and concrete were consistent with the design aesthetic of the Bauhaus. While the general town plan was established before he was hired, Kastner eliminated a significant feature that existed on most prior plans, a lake on the eastern side of South Rochdale Avenue, formed by the damming of Empty Box Brook. He followed the advice of a consultant he called in, who said this constituted fighting nature on a grand scale with significant negative environmental impact. On a much smaller, more informal scale, this did occur.
Empty Box Creek was dammed at Rochdale Avenue, just beyond where the store is, and that was our swimming pool. We swam there.
The first 35 houses constructed were on Homestead Lane and a portion of North Rochdale Avenue.
Well, one of the things that I recall as a child is that we moved in and there were about 20 houses, and the others were all under construction. And I remember playing on the piles of construction, the lumber, the hills of dirt. Everything was just really wide open. We had dirt roads at the time.
At the same time as Kastner, who insisted on signing off on every detail, rushed to complete the houses, there were those who disliked one thing or another about the project.
But there was a great deal of opposition to it at the time. You always have, this is America, you always have these regressive forces saying you're doing something communistic or socialistic or against the free enterprise system.
The fact that Jersey Homesteads was located midway between Philadelphia and New York put it very much in the public's eye, not just locally, but nationally. There was a great flood of people curious to see these strange completed houses. The first 7 homesteader families, who had been selected many months in advance in a rigorous process, having put down a deposit of $500, or roughly $8,000 in today's money, were finally allowed to occupy their new homes in July of 1936.
The early settlers that came here, of course, came from tenements where they lived in these hot tenements with maybe one toilet on the floor and 5 or 6 people sleeping in a room. And then they came out here, and these houses were like on a half acre of ground.
Most, but not all, came from New York City, seeking a better life.
The people who came to Roosevelt were not poor people. These were, if you will, highly stable, relatively well-off, working-class families.
Their finances may have been limited, but their lives were rich, as noted in this article.
People, when I look back at these people, knowing what I know now, that the world is in a simple place, I'm pretty impressed with not only their adventurousness, but their intellectual and their, their interests and stuff.
I believe so. I believe it really fulfilled their dream because my father was a garment worker and worked in a sweatshop. My mother worked in the needle trade also, but she stopped working when my brother and I were born. And their dream was to come and have a house and have land and be able to raise their children in fresh air and sunshine, as trite as it sounds. That was their dream.
My parents became friendly with a family who told them about this wonderful new community called Jersey Homesteads, where a family could rent a huge 3-bedroom house with land to grow vegetables and provide employment in a factory there, all for $16 a month. It sounded too good to be true. One Saturday, we jumped into my cousin's jalopy and off we went to search for Jersey Homesteads. It was an exhausting 2-hour trip.
They came out in groups depending upon which houses were ready. And one of the things that they decided was that since there were so many people coming out at one time, the only fair way to distribute the housing was based on a lottery, but it was not a pure lottery because it depended upon a couple of other items, such as how many children you had. If you had one child, you were not eligible to pull in the lottery for a 4-bedroom house. The people who had no children at all were the ones they picked the lottery for the 2-bedroom houses.
I think considering the times and considering what the people ultimately paid for the home and what we paid for the home when we bought it in the 60s, we really got our money's worth. I think for $19 a month or whatever it was that my parents paid rent, of course you can't compare it to what the times are today, but they really, really got a lot.
The construction continued at a fast pace, the drafting room cranking out everything from grading plans to closet specifications, a virtual flood of detailed plans, all approved by A.K., Alfred Kastner.
On Homestead Lane was developed. I think there were 10 houses that were developed on Homestead Lane beginning from the corner. And ours was the second group of families that came in. But there were houses, it didn't take long after that until other people moved in as well. The houses were well under construction. It was just a matter of, I guess, the final finishing.
Get that Jersey Homestead, look at that Jersey Homestead muds, the street weren't paved, so, you come in with muddy boots.
Along with doing everything else, Kastner found time to submit a model of the houses for a show entitled Architecture and Government Housing at the Museum of Modern Art. In a New Yorker article, Louis Mumford, probably the preeminent housing critic of the era, called it perhaps the best on view, surely the most adventurous, the most stimulating. Construction continued through 1937 and was completed the following year. While Kastner felt that the work he did was on budget, the total project cost 4 to 5 times the government's initial allocation. But it was probably a low estimate to begin with, compounded by corruption and mismanagement prior to Kastner, and then by extensive experimentation as well. However, it's quite possible that without his forceful drive and his array of skills, Jersey Homesteads may never have been built, certainly not as we know it today. Well before the last of the 200 homes was completed, there was a detailed housing plan for the entire town. At first glance, these shapes look like a mix of similar geometric markings, but looked at more closely, each represents a specific house model and how it is oriented on its plot of land. On the most basic level, there are 4 types of houses: 1-story detached, 1-story attached, 2-story detached, and 2-story attached. Actually, there are 2 other types of 2-story homes. A quite similar detached version, which appears on the 3 courts in town, and a very different attached version that has a much larger area of common wall. Residents of Roosevelt, especially long-term ones, have a sense that a lot of the homes are somewhat similar.
Yeah, the houses were pretty much the same. They were just pretty much the same. You would walk into the house, and if you knew people in town, when you walked into any, you could walk into any new house for the first time, you know what the layout was because it was the same as somebody else's or somebody else's, or the mirrored version of it, which is interesting.
To understand the origins of these small dwellings that represent something similar but different, it is necessary to go back to the point at which Alfred Kastner was hired. His early correspondence states that some foundations were in the ground before he took charge. Some scholars have accepted this as a fact, and that is the position taken in this documentary. However, there is some evidence that suggests all of the foundations already existed, possibly laid by Twachtman or some unidentified architect. It's not difficult to see that this foundation with a detached garage and storage area could have evolved under Kastner's control to one with an attached garage and a slightly different configuration. Similarly, two adjacent homes whose garages were attached could have quite easily resulted in two houses attached at the garage. All of this could be dismissed as wild conjecture if it weren't for the fact that foundations of this type with detached garages were indeed built on what would have become the continuation of present-day Brown Street and also on Lake Drive. Whatever Kastner inherited, there can be no question that he was under intense pressure from many quarters. So these foundations, and almost assuredly their floor plans, may have been a head start, but they may also have been a burden. Regardless, such plans would have merely indicated the layout of the rooms and left a great number of things not determined, including a flat or pitched roof, window placement, or even building materials. Kastner and his drafting room staff swiftly plowed ahead, developing the floor plans for 12 models in under 2 months. It probably will never be known for sure who actually designed them, but it is clear from Kastner's daily reports that he and Kahn worked together on them. Kastner had this to say about his interview with Kahn.
I'm going to get you this job as assistant architect if you keep your mouth shut and you do what the goddamn hell we have to do to get this thing finished. Now, that's all that's I require. I said, if you want to be the architect, that's right. I don't give a goddamn, but let's get this thing finished.
Kastner had designed some quite similar low-cost housing a few years before. Kahn had developed a plan for a 4-family housing unit in 1933 and was working on a modernist synagogue at the time he was hired.
In the final analysis, there's no way to know for sure, basically. Kastner was the architect, Kahn was his assistant. I'm sure they were both involved in varying degrees.
With the exception of the attached structure, which consists of a combination of a 3-bedroom house and a 2-bedroom house, another intriguing fact is that each of the other 4 sketches of the 2-bedroom models have designed by initials on them, of junior architects of the drafting room. While Kastner probably provided design guidelines, the urgency of the project may have given his staff a greater degree of control than usual.
What the evidence suggests, and we're limited in our knowledge, but we actually have a fair amount of it to come to some conclusions. And the evidence clearly shows that there was a collaboration between the two, as well as the other draftspeople who were in the office.
Probably more important than who designed the homes is the fact that the 12 basic plans were able to be manipulated to generate a large number of variations.
Even though the concept is very straightforward and very simple, the variations that Kastner rang on the concept are really fascinating, and the way the planes of the facades and the elevations are varied in the different models and the different siding plans are absolutely fascinating. And one thing, for example, each of the houses has a slightly different plane in the front and in the back, at least the one-story houses. And sometimes they're reversed, so the back will go towards the street, sometimes it'll be the opposite. And so there's a great deal of variation, even though the basic concept is very, very straightforward and even rudimentary.
The flexibility of the plans can be demonstrated by looking at just one model. This is a rough diagram of its floor plan, which we'll call the base plan. The garage is orange, storage area blue. If these two areas are broken off, rotated 90 degrees, then reattached with the storage area behind the garage, the floor plan becomes this. From the same view, here are the base plan house and the modified house. The garage, of course, faces the street, so from the street they look very different. But the core of the houses, the living room, eat-in kitchen, and bedrooms, is positioned the same in each one. If a massive helicopter were to pick up that modified house and place it across the street, then it might look like this from the street. What was the back of the modified house has now become the front of this new house, which means, of course, that the front of the modified house is now the back of the new one. The primary reason for doing this was to give the main living areas, the living room often with oversized windows, and the eat-in kitchen, a southern exposure, bringing more light into these houses. In fact, to the extent that the layout of the streets and the design of the particular model permitted, Kastner and his team consistently oriented these areas, as well as the porch, in this direction. One of the principles of the Bauhaus was to maximize light and air entering the structure. It's difficult to imagine that a more contemporary builder would use a house design that allows the back of the house to work equally as well as the front in facing the street, or who would make a southern exposure such a high priority. If the second modified house slides back across the street and lines up to the right of the first modified one, we see that changes other than siting on the lot have occurred. They are virtually mirror images of each other. This was a common way the floor plans were rearranged, done largely to add visual variety. Looking more closely, we can see yet another change in the house labeled Modification II. To permit a large south-facing porch and at the same time assuring its privacy by placing it on the non-street side, the blue storage area has now moved to the side of the garage. The indicative two small windows of this area can be seen between the front door and the garage. This tweaking of the plan is another example of the style-driven inventiveness of the architects. Remember that all of these modifications were to just one base model. This creation of variations is demonstrated by the fact that, with the exception of 3 houses, all of the homes on Homestead Lane are derived from just 3 base models, and these same 3, plus one more, that is 4 models, are the basis of 2/3 of all of the 200 original houses. When such variables as detached versus attached, window placement, and dining room versus eat-in kitchen are added to the mix, a large number of house configurations and appearances result. The 12 base models are best understood as starting points from which a great many similar but different homes were generated, all exhibiting Bauhaus-derived style features.
So when we came out here, because of the metaphor of the time we were living in, it was like, well, look at all the room, look at all the space, look at all the closets, but couldn't they have made them look like, you know, houses with little pointy roofs? You know, what is this?
This was the homesteader's usual reaction, impressed with the interiors and disappointed with the exteriors, having expected a more conventional design. The most striking feature was the flat roof, which gave a dramatically different horizontal emphasis to the houses. It was not just a matter of aesthetics, but practicality, according to Gropius.
No hanging gutters, external rain pipes, or an alternate road. So he thought that this would be cheaper to maintain and be a more utilitarian house, and that was what they were looking for.
Over time, a number of residents have felt otherwise.
It's my husband, who was at the School of Architecture at Princeton. We replaced the flat roof 3 times. And the last time, when there were coffee cans across the living room, catching the drips, he said, "The hell with the integrity of the architecture."
Unlike most houses, all 2-story and 1-story homes with 2 bedrooms were built with wooden roofs. Curiously, they were among the last houses completed, but all roofs got a surface coating of asphalt and gravel.
They all had pebbles on the roofs too. They all had this. The roofs were all done with these little round pea stones or something like that, which I think were to I don't know what they were for a different thing, but some say they mitigate the effect of sudden heat and cold change, which makes the tar crack.
Overhangs on the 1-story houses give a limited shading from the summer sun, providing mainly a sense of depth to the structure. They possibly reflect a modernist heritage that can be traced back to Frank Lloyd Wright's prairie houses a few decades earlier. The buildings were constructed of cinder block, sprayed with a coat of stucco, and painted white. The facades of most homes possess projections and recesses, which provide variety as well as a play of light and shadow. Garages are often one of those projections. Except for a very few houses in town, each home has one, usually attached, but not always. They were a luxury feature for the settlers.
Nobody had 2 cars then, only 1 car, and many people never had a car. So in our case, my father didn't drive until my brother went off to the army.
Porches, usually covered, make an exterior style statement in a different way. They break up the solidity of the facade, as well as provide a social function. Most detached 2-story houses achieved an openness differently, with a breezeway. Windows came in a variety of shapes and sizes. Usually the largest or greatest number of windows face south, but sometimes east if the site or model required it.
Well, I think the one notable feature that comes to mind is the floor-to-ceiling windows, which again are a reflection of a kind of a simplified aesthetic and a departure from conventional practice.
Such windows were not necessarily reacted to as a positive feature.
The windows, don't forget all these people came from a culture where heating, you didn't have heat in Russia, where we came from. So there were all the windows, and you're going to have to pay for the heating. So some people, you weren't allowed to change anything, so people would kind of cover up the windows as much as they could. And they hated the windows that went down to like this. We built this afterward. But when in the original houses, you have these long windows, like, who needs that?
Over time, the bottom portion of some of these windows was filled in. It's just not possible to pass over a final, small, exterior style element. Look at this dwelling. Look a little closer. That's right, there is such a thing as a curved line in this community, an original feature of the dozen homes, in contrast to the standard design.
Now, the houses are very functional. They were quite comfortable in size and conveniences for the time. In fact, they were very much so.
As you enter a typical Roosevelt house, there is a small foyer where there is a coat closet. This opens out to a living room, often containing a large window facing south. The relatively open floor plan is demonstrated by the connection to the bedroom hallway and also to the entrance to the kitchen.
I remember a few years later when I was a teenager and I visited with a friend of mine, and we went to visit my aunt and uncle, and we were so excited about the living room and the enormity of it. We were rolling around on the floor, doing modern dance exercises. We had never seen a place that was so spacious, you know, not a place to live in.
The kitchen was very basic. One of the things that when we moved into our house in about 1960, the hot water heater was in the kitchen.
The kitchen with a dinette area with windows, which I found very attractive. It was very nicely built.
About 20% of the original 200 homes have a dining room. The bedroom hallway is covered with parquet flooring, a luxury feature that appears throughout the house, except in the kitchen and bathroom. The utility room is usually on this hallway. Each bedroom has a closet, and there is a linen closet in the bathroom.
When they moved into the houses, this was pre-consumer time. I mean, you would be happy if you had enough to eat and clothe yourself. And they found all these closets. Now that was incredible, the amount of closet space when people were not, you know, it was a pre-consumer era.
The bedrooms, like all rooms, are serviced by a forced hot air system, unusual for the time, with heat registers located high on the walls and return grills in the floor.
I remember my cousin telling me that there was a 20-degree difference between the floor and the ceiling, and that the floors were very cold in these houses.
Nothing under the floor. It was freezing. It was always freezing. But we got used to that.
There is an entrance from the foyer to the porch, which in turn connects to the storage area.
The workroom was usually used as a storage area. People did canning. A lot of people had gardens and they canned, and so they put storage shelves in, and that was used for storage.
This area leads into the garage. One internal feature can lead to a little speculation about the possible designer of one of the house types. This model, the one that had the unusual curved porch roof projections, also has a curving tubular railing to the second floor. Is it possible that this railing could have been inspired by the famed modernist Le Corbusier, whose work during the 1920s was well known by architects of the day? Is it probable that of the team of architects who worked on Jersey Homesteads, Louis Kahn was the most enamored of his work, stating in later life that, "You see, Le Corbusier was my teacher. I say Paul Cray, his college mentor, was my teacher, and Corbusier was my teacher." Is it purely coincidental that railings like these appear in Kahn's 1933 proposed housing unit for a Philadelphia project, a building which has some resemblance to this Jersey Homesteads model? Maybe. Maybe not. Much more important is grasping the social and economic context of the time in which these homes were built.
In the 1930s, the idea that each person's house should have complete plumbing, indoor plumbing, hot and cold water, tub, shower, the works, was not by any means a given, and probably 30 to 40% of all American families at that time did not have complete indoor plumbing by what we would consider to be the minimum standard today. So the houses were certainly comfortable and well furnished by 1930s standards. These were definitely middle-class houses.
Just as in Levittown, New York, and many other communities, changes in Roosevelt's housing have taken place over time.
Clearly, a lot of people want to expand and improve on these houses. I mean, they were very nice houses by the standards of the 30s, but by today's standards, in terms of middle and upper income people, they tend to be small and very limited. So people do tend to want to expand. And I think a lot of people have gone to great lengths to try to do it in a way that's compatible with the basic architecture. But they've used the same materials. They've tried to, when they've changed the mass of the elevation, they've tried to do it in a way that was in proportion and was appropriate.
Nature's landscaping has evolved, and also changes of one type or another to individual houses have had the effect of altering to some degree the streetscapes of the very early days of Jersey homesteads. And a few structures have even been transformed from other uses to become typical Roosevelt homes. But the original configuration of streets and green spaces of this garden town remains, and because of preservation, will continue to be there. The conceptual seeds came from Western Europe, took root in the farmland of central New Jersey, and matured as a unique community that is appreciated by those who live there, and by those who take the time to learn its heritage.